The house on Caldwell Lane had learned to be quiet. It had not always been that way. For 43 years, those rooms had rung with the sounds of living. The clatter of a cast-iron skillet on a gas burner, the particular way Evelyn hummed when she couldn't remember the words to a song, the low murmur of a television turned up too loud because Arthur's hearing had never fully recovered from the war. The house had been full, in the way that a house only becomes full when two people have spent decades filling it with the ordinary debris of a shared life. Now it was January, and the house had been quiet for 6 months, and Arthur Pendleton was 72 years old and did not know what to do with the silence. He stood in the kitchen at 6 in the morning. He knew it was 6 because the clock on the microwave played a tinny 3-note chime every hour. One of Evelyn's additions after his vision had finally surrendered to the glaucoma 7 years ago. His fingers found the edge of the countertop, found the coffee maker, found the mug with the chip on the rim that he always kept to the left of the machine. These were the coordinates of his world now. Not latitude and longitude, but texture and distance. The number of steps between one safe place and the next. 12 steps from the bedroom to the bathroom. 22 steps from the kitchen to the front door. Evelyn had counted them with him, her voice patient and warm, her hand steady on his arm. 14 to the garden gate. Arthur. Mind the loose stone at 11. She had been his eyes for 7 years. And then, on a Tuesday night in July, while walking home from her book club, a walk she had made 100 times, along a road she knew in her bones, a car had come out of the dark and taken her from him. The police had called it a hit and run. Sheriff Miller had driven out to the house personally, his voice carrying that practiced weight of official sympathy, and told Arthur there were no witnesses, no useful physical evidence, that these things were sometimes impossible to solve. Arthur had thanked him with the hollow politeness of a man who no longer felt attached to the surface of events. He had attended the funeral by memorizing the number of steps from the car to the gravesite. 28 steps on uneven ground. He had made them alone, his white cane tapping ahead of him like a blind man's heartbeat, because there was no one left to count them with. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, Arthur had been moving through the world like a man navigating a ship that had lost its instruments. He ate when he remembered to eat. He slept in fitful 2-hour stretches, always waking in that terrible suspended moment when the mind hasn't yet remembered what it has lost. It was into this silence that Sarah McIntosh called on a cold Thursday morning in January. Sarah was 25, a volunteer at the Millhaven Animal Shelter, and she had known Evelyn through the Parish Charity Committee. She had the kind of gentle persistence that could only come from genuine compassion. She had called twice before, each time inviting Arthur to come in and just meet some of the animals, no pressure, not looking for any commitment. Each time, Arthur had declined with a politeness that was also a wall. On the third call, she said something different. "There's a dog here, Mr. Pendleton," she said. "He's scheduled for tomorrow morning. I don't know why, but I keep thinking you should meet him first." Arthur heard something in her voice that went beyond the usual shelter volunteer script, a kind of quiet urgency that didn't sound like a sales pitch. It sounded like someone reporting a fact they couldn't fully explain. "What kind of dog?" he asked, before he decided he was going to ask anything. "A German Shepherd, 7 years old. He only has 3 legs, lost the right front one. He's been here for 4 months, and nobody's touched his card. He doesn't bark much. Sarah paused. He just sits and watches the door." Arthur was quiet for a moment. The kitchen clock chimed 7. "All right," he said. The shelter smelled of disinfectant, cedar shavings, and the warm, complicated animal smell that Arthur found, to his surprise, not unpleasant. Sarah had met him at the door and walked beside him with the careful attentiveness of someone who understood that she was not to grip his arm unless he asked. She told him about the shelter as they walked. 43 dogs currently, mostly medium-sized mixed breeds, and her voice guided him the way a good voice should, without condescension, without false cheer. The kennel was loud. Dogs of every temperament announced themselves as they passed. The sharp, territorial barks of anxious animals, the excited yelping of a young dog throwing itself at the chain link, the low, conversational woofs of older dogs with nothing left to prove. Arthur's cane swept carefully along the corridor floor, and the noise pressed against him from every side. And then there was a space of quiet. His cane touched something. Not the floor, not the chain link. Something warm and alive and absolutely still. "That's him," Sarah said softly. That's Max. Arthur crouched down slowly, the way a man of 72 who has replaced both hips must crouch, with deliberation and without grace. He extended one hand and waited. He did not reach for the dog. He had always understood that you did not reach for something that had been hurt. You held out your hand, and you let the hurt thing decide. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then a cold, rough nose pressed against Arthur's palm. It was not an eager thing. It was not the enthusiastic nuzzling of a pet eager to please. It was a deliberate, considered contact, a dog's way of reading a person, a careful inspection rather than a greeting. The nose moved slowly across his knuckles, the back of his hand, the inside of his wrist. And then a large, heavy head lowered itself into Arthur's palm and rested there, with the stillness of something that has finally stopped running. Arthur felt the absence where the right foreleg should have been. He felt the ridged topography of old scars along the dog's flank, legible under his fingertips like a text in a language he was only beginning to understand. He felt the slow, even breath of an animal that was not afraid, only tired, only very, very tired. What happened to him? Arthur asked. We don't really know, Sarah said, and her voice carried something she was choosing not to say. He came to us from the county pound. No intake records, just a number tag. Arthur's thumb moved slowly behind a dog's ear. He felt the ridge of scar tissue there too. Was he a working dog? We think so. The way he moves, the way he responds to certain words. He's clearly been trained, but we can't find any department that will claim him. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. In the kennel around him, the other dogs continued their chorus of need and boredom and hope. Max made no sound at all. He simply rested his head in Arthur's hand, breathing steadily, waiting to see what this old man would decide. Get me the paperwork, Arthur said. Max adapted to the house on Caldwell Lane with a speed and precision that Arthur found, in the first days, quietly astonishing. He had anticipated difficulties. He'd had vague plans for formal training, for the patient process of teaching a dog the layout of the space. He'd even asked Sarah whether there were K9 retraining programs for retired working dogs that might help Max learn guide dog protocols. But Max seemed to need no such instruction. On the first morning, Arthur was making his way from the bedroom to the bathroom. 12 steps, turn left, avoid the nightstand, and became aware of a warm, solid presence moving just ahead of him, pausing at the doorframe, then moving on. By the third day, he understood that Max had memorized the house's floor plan with a thoroughness that went beyond mere habit. When Arthur reached the kitchen and his fingers searched the counter for the chip-rimmed mug, he'd find Max already sitting on the far side of the kitchen, positioned so that he was not in the path of Arthur's movements. When Arthur walked in the garden, Max moved 3 paces ahead, always keeping himself between Arthur and the uneven edge of the stone path. It was not guide dog training. It was something more instinctive, the tactical awareness of a dog who had spent years learning to move through difficult terrain without making errors, without making noise, without giving anything away. During the day, Max was quiet and steady. He would lie beside Arthur's armchair while Arthur listened to his audio books, his warmth pressed against Arthur's ankle like a living anchor. When Arthur wept, and he did weep, in the afternoons, when the silence of the house became most absolute, Max would rise without ceremony and place his head on Arthur's knee, not demanding comfort, but offering it, his weight a kind of wordless ballast. Arthur began to understand why Sarah had called. But then the nights began. The first night, Arthur was awakened by a sound he couldn't immediately place, a slow, grinding drag, something heavy moving across hardwood. He lay still and listened. The sound moved around the bedroom, methodical and purposeful, and then there was a solid thunk against the base of the window and another against the doorframe. Max, he said quietly. The dragging stopped. In the silence, he could hear the dog's breathing, steady and focused. Then a soft click of 3 claws on wood, and the weight of Max lowering himself to the floor at the foot of the bed. In the morning, Arthur's groping foot found, at the bedroom doorway, his heavy iron walking cane laid across the threshold. Against the windowsill, he discovered a stack of books, the large print volumes Evelyn had kept before he'd switched entirely to audio, placed like a low barricade at the base of the glass. He stood there for a moment, running his fingers over the arrangement, his cane across the door, books along the window. He thought of what Sarah had said. He clearly has been trained. and he thought of the way Max moved through the house, patient and tactical and always watching the exits. Poor thing, Arthur murmured to himself. Whatever they put you through. He assumed it was trauma, the compulsive nest building of an anxious animal, trying to create safety in a new environment. Each night, he would gently return the books to their shelves, the cane to its spot by the bed, and each morning he would find them redeployed, Max's quiet nocturnal industry undone and repeated like a tide. He did not know that his barricades were not about fear. He did not know that Max was not building a nest. He was building a perimeter. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after Max came home with Arthur. A knock on the door with the specific rhythm of someone who considers themselves entitled to be answered quickly. Arthur's cane found the front hallway. Beside him, Max moved silently to the left, positioning himself between Arthur and the door with a quiet deliberateness that Arthur had come to recognize. Uncle Arthur. Derek's voice was the kind of smooth that had been practiced in a mirror. 35 years old, Arthur's brother's youngest son, a man whose pleasantness had always had the quality of a surface, convincing until you pressed on it. And I brought Sheriff Miller along. Thought it might be nice to see a friendly face. Derek, Arthur said. He stepped back to allow them in. The moment they crossed the threshold, Max changed. Arthur heard it first, a low, subsonic vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the dog's chest. Not quite a growl, more fundamental than that. The hair rose on the back of Arthur's neck in sympathetic response. He had heard dogs make many sounds in his life, but this sound had a quality that was different from aggression or fear. It was recognition. Easy, Arthur said quietly, but his hand found Max's collar, and he could feel the vibration running through the whole body of the dog like a current. That the new dog? Miller said. The sheriff's voice was easy, practiced, carrying that particular law enforcement calm that was as much performance as character. Big thing. What happened to his leg? He's a rescue, Arthur said. 3 legs. Miller laughed shortly. Liability is what he is. You want to be careful with an animal like that, Arthur. Unpredictable. You can't always tell what a dog with that kind of history might do. Under Arthur's hand, the vibration in Max's body had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened, found a register below hearing, something Arthur felt in his sternum rather than his ears. He could feel Max's nose working, those long inhalations that he'd come to understand were the dog cataloging, filing, remembering. Derek moved through the living room with the confidence of a man who has already decided something belongs to him. Arthur heard the particular footfall of a person assessing rather than visiting, pausing at the window that overlooked the property, testing the weight of the chair that had been Arthur's father's. The reason we're here, Uncle Art, Derek said, settling into the rhythm of something rehearsed, is that we've been worried about you. This house, all this space, the 2 of you here alone, it's a lot to manage. I manage fine. You manage fine now, Miller said smoothly, picking up the handoff. But you're in a vulnerable position here, Arthur. Big house, isolated property. We've had some incidents in the county. Break-ins, mostly. An elderly resident living alone. No offense. It's not an ideal situation. None taken, Arthur said, and meant none of it. The papers came out eventually, as he'd known they would. Derek placed them on the table with a careful casualness, sliding them toward Arthur's hands as if forgetting, momentarily, that Arthur could not read them. Just a simple power of attorney arrangement. Let me handle the administrative burden of the house while you're in transition. And there's a very good facility in Barton Falls, very reasonable, staff-to-resident ratio is excellent. I'm not going to a facility, Arthur said. Uncle Art. I'm not going to a facility, Derek. And I'm not signing anything today. Arthur's voice had the flatness of a man who has made a great many final decisions in his life and knows what one feels like. Thank you for coming. The visit ended with the shape of a door closing and 2 sets of footsteps on the porch. But before they had fully moved away, Arthur heard Miller pause, the slight hesitation of a man who has seen something that stopped his internal monologue mid-sentence. A low, final sound came from Max. Not a growl. Something more precise than that. More like a declaration. I know who you are. Arthur stood alone in his living room for a long moment after the car had pulled away, his hand still on Max's collar, feeling the slow decrescendo of that terrible vibration in the dog's chest. What do you know that I don't? He asked the dog. Max pressed against his leg and said nothing. There are things that cannot be undone by forgetting them. The smell of rain on asphalt. The smell of a particular brand of engine oil. The sharp chemical smell of a car interior mixed with the mineral smell of fear sweat from a man who has just run over something living. A dog's olfactory memory has no expiration date and no delete function. What it records permanently, laid down in the brain with the permanence of scar tissue. On a wet night in July, 7 months ago, Max had been working. He had been working the best night of his career and the worst night of his life, and these two things had arrived simultaneously, the way catastrophe often does, wearing the costume of a routine assignment. The call had come in at 10:17, a pedestrian fatality on Route 9, possible hit and run. Max's handler, Officer Chun, had brought him in to work the scene, and Max had done what he always did, put his nose down and begun reading the story the road was trying to tell. The story had been clear. A vehicle moving at speed, a hard turn onto the gravel shoulder, an effort to stop that was abandoned, a tire track cutting through the soft verge into the tree line. The driver had kept going, but panic had made him careless, and a panicked man is never as invisible as he believes. Max had worked the scent trail for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. He had no concept of clock time, but his internal sense of sustained effort was exact, and the trail had led him through the trees to a service road where a dark-colored sedan was parked. The door was open. A man was standing beside it, still wearing his seat belt receipt, the chemical narrative of alcohol and cortisol, and something deeper and darker. The smell of a man who has done something he cannot take back, rising off him in waves. Max had gone into his alert posture and held it, and then a second vehicle had arrived. He'd recognized the second smell immediately, Sheriff Miller's patrol car. He'd been in that car before, at scene briefings, at training exercises. The smell was as familiar as his own kennel. He had expected the familiar sounds of law enforcement procedure, the sound of a crime being witnessed and recorded and set in motion toward justice. Instead, he heard Miller's voice saying, quietly and with great precision, "Get back in the car. Leave the dog to me." The patrol car had struck him from behind. Max had no human language for what had happened next. He had the sensation of impact, the bright animal terror of a body betrayed by physics, the grinding awareness of something structurally wrong with his right foreleg, the ground rising, and then the cold, wet grass against his face. He had the memory of Miller's boots beside him, not helping. The sound of the sedan pulling away on the service road. Miller's voice on the radio, reporting a K-9 unit down, injured in the field, no sign of suspect. The official version of events already fully formed before Arthur's wife had been on the ground for 20 minutes. He remembered the shelter. He remembered 4 months of that particular institutional smell, disinfectant, metal, the low-frequency anxiety of animals in close quarters, and the door at the end of the corridor that sometimes opened and let in a different smell. Cold air, the outside world, the possibility of something beyond. He remembered the old man's hand. An old man's hands carry everything. The hands that extended toward him that Thursday in January carried the smell of coffee and of whatever the old man had eaten for breakfast and of the wood of a cane worn smooth by years of handling. But underneath all of that, buried deep in the skin the way grief embeds itself in everything it touches, was a smell Max had encountered once before. It was the same grief that lived in the dark-colored sedan, the same grief that lived in the service road at the edge of the trees. A shape of loss he had last smelled pressed into asphalt on Route 9. He had put his head into the old man's hand, and he had made a decision. February came to Millhaven with sleet and short days and a peculiar desperation of men whose plans are running out of time. Derek had debts that were not the kind of debts you could ask a bank to restructure. The men he owed money to had their own methods of issuing payment reminders, and the last reminder had been delivered in the form of 2 broken windows in his apartment above the hardware store. The house on Caldwell Lane, 4 bedrooms, 2 acres, assessed at just over $400,000, was not so much an inheritance to Derek as it was a pressure valve, the only available escape from a compression that was becoming physical. He had explained this to Miller over bourbon, and Miller had listened with the patience of a man who has his own reasons for wanting the same thing, his own quiet terror of what an old blind man might stumble upon in his own house. She threw something Miller had told him on the night it happened. "Before she went down, I saw her arm. I need to know if she had a phone on her. if she had anything that recorded. They had searched the road. They had searched her purse, still miraculously intact on the shoulder. They had found nothing. But nothing was not the same as safe, and the 6 months since July had done nothing to cure Miller of the particular insomnia that comes with unfinished business. The old man needed to move. The house needed to be emptied and sold before anyone started asking questions about what might be in it. On a Wednesday night in late February, Derek parked his car 3 blocks from Caldwell Lane and walked the rest of the way through sleet that made the streetlights look like smeared watercolors. His breath fogged in front of him. His boots crunched on frozen grass as he left the road and moved toward the side of the house where the electrical panel was mounted on the exterior wall. The panel was the work of 5 minutes. A simple power cut, a scare, a reminder of vulnerability. That was all. He was not ready to escalate. Not yet. He was 4 feet from the panel when his right foot came down on something that rolled, and the world tilted. The sound of his fall was enormous in the frozen night air, his full weight hitting the icy ground, his elbow taking the impact, his curse bitten off before it fully formed. He lay for a moment on the cold earth, disoriented, trying to understand what had happened. His hand found the thing that had rolled under his foot, a glass bottle, and beside it, his fingers discovered another, an irregular line of them, 3 or 4, placed with the precision of objects arranged rather than simply left there, positioned in the narrow, dark channel between the fence and the electrical panel where any intruder moving along the wall would have to walk. The lights in the house remained off. The house remained entirely quiet. And then, from behind the dark window 3 feet above his head, came a sound that Derek would not be able to describe accurately for the rest of his life. It was low and it was unhurried, and it had none of the frantic edge of a dog that has been startled. It was the sound of something that was not startled at all, something that had been waiting, something that had known he was coming. Derek rose from the ground with a speed that his knees did not appreciate. He walked back to his car faster than he'd left it, his hands shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. In the dark bedroom of the house on Caldwell Lane, Arthur lay awake with his hands on his chest, listening to his own heartbeat and the sound of distant footsteps retreating on frozen ground. Beside the window, Max stood perfectly still, watching the dark with eyes built for exactly this. He did not bark again. He had said what needed to be said. It was on a Sunday in early March that Max found the iron box. Arthur had developed the habit of taking a slow circuit of the garden each afternoon, when the light, though meaningless to him, was at least warm on his face. The garden had been Evelyn's domain. She had known the name of every plant in it, had known when things needed watering and when they needed to be left alone, and her knowledge of it was one of those forms of expertise that only become visible through their absence. Arthur walked the stone path and listened to the birds and smelled the cold mineral smell of thawing soil and tried, as he did every day, to feel something other than the specific quality of pain that had become his constant weather. Max was off the path. Arthur could hear him by the old oak, the largest tree in the garden, a tree that had been there since before the house. And the sound he was making was not the casual sniffing of a dog investigating interesting smells. It was deep, rhythmic digging, the focused labor of an animal following something specific to its source. "Max," Arthur said, "come away from there." The digging continued. Arthur moved off the path carefully, testing the ground ahead with his cane, until he was close enough to feel the displaced earth under his feet. He crouched down and his hands found the excavation, 6 inches deep, maybe 8, with the careful precision of a dog that was not digging randomly, but targeting a specific point. Then his fingers found the chain. It was fine silver, very familiar to his fingertips. He had fastened it around her neck 100 times. The clasp was stubborn and had always required 2 attempts. And he had unfastened it at her dressing table on ordinary evenings for 40 years. He knew this chain the way he knew his own handwriting. He sat back in the cold dirt beside the oak tree with Evelyn's necklace in his hands, and for a long time he did not move. Max nosed gently at his shoulder. "Keep going," Arthur said, in a voice that had changed register. Max dug, and 3 inches below where the necklace had been, his paw struck something solid and metallic. A small iron box, the kind used for fireproof storage of documents, sealed shut and coated in months of soil. Arthur's hands explored it. For inches square, a hinged lid held closed by a simple latch, heavy enough that lifting it required both hands. Arthur worked the latch open with his thumbnail. Inside, wrapped in a waterproof plastic bag, he found a USB drive. He sat very still beside the old oak tree and held the small plastic rectangle in his fingers, turning it over and over. His mind moved slowly through the implications, the way it moved now when something was important. Not the racing intelligence of a younger mind, but the steady, deep-drawing examination of a man who has learned the cost of reaching conclusions too quickly. Evelyn had put this here. Evelyn had put this here and covered it with soil and buried it under the roots of the tree that they had planted together on their first anniversary in this house. And then she had walked to book club on a Tuesday night and not come home. She threw something Miller had said, and Derek had covered the sound of it quickly, and Arthur had been 3 rooms away in a house he could no longer see, and none of that could be changed now. But this could be changed. He held the necklace in one hand and the USB drive in the other, and Max pressed warm and solid against his side, and the spring birds were making their spring sound in the bare branches of the oak, and Arthur Pendleton, 72 years old, blind since 65, widower since July, said quietly and absolutely clearly into the cold March air, "All right, Evelyn, I hear you." The blizzard arrived with 3 hours of warning from the radio, and then rendered those warnings meaningless by arriving with twice the forecast intensity. By 9 in the evening on a Thursday in mid-March, a date that in Millhaven would be discussed for years afterward, 12 inches of snow had fallen, and the wind had found all the thin places in the walls of the house on Caldwell Lane and was making itself known. The roads out of town had been officially closed by county emergency management at 8:45. The next county over was handling 3 simultaneous accidents. The state police detachment was 40 minutes away under good conditions and would be, tonight, effectively unreachable. Arthur sat in his armchair listening to the storm work on his house. He had the USB drive in his pocket. He had kept it on his person since finding it, not trusting it to any drawer or shelf, and Max at his feet, and the audiobook reader on the table beside him, although he had not turned it on. He had called Sarah 3 times that week. He had not told her about the USB drive directly, only that he was worried about Derek and needed to reach someone outside of Millhaven's county enforcement. Sarah had heard what lay beneath the words and had begun, quietly, making her own inquiries. She had promised to call back tonight, but the phone lines had gone down with the first hour of the storm. At 10:17, the microwave clock had chimed twice since he'd sat down. Max rose. He did not rise with the easy casualness of a dog getting up to change position. He rose with the snap and precision of a soldier leaving a resting position, all his weight redistributed, every sense aimed outward. Arthur felt the shift in the air of the room. The way the presence beside him changed quality, became something operational and alert. "What is it?" Arthur said quietly. Max moved to the window. Arthur listened. The storm was loud. It occupied the full spectrum of sound, the wind doing its complicated work against the eaves and window frames. But underneath it, after a long moment of focused listening, he caught something else, the 2 rhythmic crunch of boot steps through snow, coming from the side of the house rather than the road. Then the smell reached him, even through the sealed windows and the cold and the wind. It came, a chemical sharpness cutting through the clean smell of snow. Arthur was a veteran. He had been in places where fire was a weapon, and his nose remembered even when other faculties failed him. Gasoline. He was on his feet before he had consciously formed the intention to rise, his hand already on his cane, his body moving through the sequence of emergency that had been stored in his muscle memory since a war 50 years ago. The phone, the front door, the neighbors, the coordinates of survival. The phone was dead. He had known it would be. He moved toward the front door, and his hand found the knob, and Max pressed against his left side, directing him 3 steps right, away from the door he was reaching for, 2 steps toward the hallway. Arthur stopped. "What do you know that I don't?" He stopped, and he listened, and then, with the particular acuity of a man who has spent 7 years learning to hear the world rather than see it, he heard the soft clink of broken glass from the kitchen window, and then, below it, the spreading, whispering sigh of liquid finding the floor. The front door, then. He moved for the front door, and this time Max moved with him, and they had covered 6 of the 22 steps from the kitchen when Arthur's nose told him that the front of the house had been reached first. He stopped in the dark hallway of his own home and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has survived previous attempts by the world to kill him, that he was entirely surrounded and entirely blind, and that the only creature in the house who could see in the dark was a three-legged German shepherd with a burned history and perfect, indelible memory. "Max," Arthur said. His voice was very steady. "Get us out." Then the first flame caught. The fire did not begin gently. It began the way fire always begins in houses soaked with accelerant. All at once, a sound like a collective inhalation as the oxygen in the room committed to a new arrangement, and then the full light and heat of it pressing against Arthur's face even through the hallway wall. His eyes, useless since his 60s, registered the fire as pure heat on eyelids that had long since stopped carrying images to his brain. He moved on the heat the way a ship moves on the tide, understanding it as a force that was closing certain options and leaving others. The smoke arrived almost simultaneously, not the lazy drift of a small fire, but a dense, dropping ceiling of it, the chemical bite of burning wood and synthetic flooring and decades of accumulated domestic life going back to vapor. Arthur's lungs protested on the first breath, and by the second he was coughing, and by the third the coughing had the quality of something that could become incapacitation if it continued. He went down to one knee not from choice, but from physics. The air near the floor was survivable in a way the air above it was not. His cane clattered. He lost it. His free hand found the wall, found the baseboard, found the floor. "Max." It came out in two notes separated by a cough. A command that was also a prayer. The weight hit him from the left, the solid, specific gravity of a large dog. Not gentle but necessary, Max's good shoulder driving into Arthur's left side, and then his teeth, careful and precise, finding the fabric of Arthur's jacket at the shoulder seam. Not a bite. A grip. The grip of a dog who knows what he is doing, who has been trained to this, who has waited a long time to be needed in exactly the right way. The first pull nearly knocked Arthur sideways. Max's three-legged mechanics were different from the efficient four-point geometry of a dog with all its components, and the force that came from his remaining legs was compensated and redistributed in ways that the dog had spent 7 months learning since the service road took his leg. He did not pull in a straight line. He pulled in arcs, his weight shifting, using Arthur's moments of imbalance rather than fighting them. And Arthur, who had spent 7 years learning to trust a dog's navigation, gave himself over to it. He could hear the fire now as a roar rather than a sound. He could feel the temperature rising against his skin. Somewhere above him, a structural element, a beam, a joist, something that had been patient for 40 years, reached its limit and came down, and the crash of it shook the floor under his hands and knees and sent a wave of heat rolling through the hallway that Arthur received with his face turned against his shoulder. Max did not stop. The dog pulled and Arthur crawled, and the fire remade the house around them in real time. And Arthur thought, in the strange suspended cognition of a man in extremity, of Evelyn walking home on a Tuesday night, of the sound a car makes when it does not stop, of the USB drive in his pocket, of the iron box under the oak tree, of how many times in his life he had been most alive in proximity to death. The front door. He felt Max's direction change, a sharp correction left, and his shoulder hit the door frame, and his hand found the knob, and turned it, and the cold of the night rushed over him like water, like the cleanest thing he had ever felt. And then they were on the porch, and then the steps, 2 of them. He counted them. And then the snow, the cold, the enormous relief of ground that was not on fire. Arthur collapsed onto his side in the snow and coughed until there was nothing left to cough. The snow pressed cold and healing against his face. He could hear the fire behind him, thoroughly committed to its work on his house, and above it the wind, and below everything else the sound of Max's breathing. Ragged, labored, not right. His hand found the dog. Max was lying beside him. The fur along his back had the brittle, wrong texture of something that has been in direct contact with flame. The smell that rose from it was terrible, but the breathing was there, rhythmic, working, the breathing of an animal that has decided it is not finished. And then Arthur's hand found, held in Max's teeth, the USB drive. He had not realized, could not have realized, from his position in the smoke-filled hallway, that Max had detoured, that in the burning house that was running out of time, the three-legged dog had turned aside from the door and moved back through the fire toward the table where Arthur had set the drive down before the lights went out, had taken it in his mouth with the same careful precision with which he had once held the scent trails of criminals on cold country roads. Arthur closed his fingers around the USB drive. He closed his other hand in the charred fur behind Max's ear. He lay in the snow in front of his burning house, and he held on to both of those things with the absolute clarity of a man who knows exactly what he is holding. "Good boy," he said, in the oldest and most inadequate language available to the moment. "Good boy, Max." From somewhere down the road, through the dying storm, came the sound of sirens. Sarah had known something was wrong at 8 o'clock. She had been trying Arthur's line for 2 hours, getting nothing. But it wasn't only the dead phone line that had moved her. It was the accumulation of small things she had been noting in her private log for 3 weeks. Derek's visits to the shelter asking probing questions about what that old man with the dog had found in his yard. Miller's cruiser parked outside the shelter twice in 1 week with no business to attend to. The way Miller had looked at Max on the day she'd seen them all together in the street. A look she'd filed at the time as recognition she didn't fully understand. She had called the state police at 8:30, citing what she had, which was not much, but which was enough. She had given names. She had said the word hit and run and the year and the road number, and the officer on the other end had listened in a way that told her she was not the first person to bring those words together in that configuration. The state police had been 43 minutes away in the storm. The fire had bought 17 of those minutes by illuminating the sky above Caldwell Lane in a way that shortened the search considerably. Derek and Miller arrived at the scene playing the parts they had played all their lives. Derek in the role of concerned nephew, appearing from the crowd of neighbors who had gathered at the orange edge of the spectacle. Miller in uniform, the representative of civic order, his radio already in his hand, making the sounds of institutional response. They did not see Max until Max was already in motion. The dog came up from the snow at the side of the drive, and 3 seconds later Miller was on the ground with 110 pounds of German Shepherd distributed across his chest and a hand-sized glass bottle held motionless in Max's teeth. It was a bottle with the remaining residue of gasoline in it, retrieved from the snow beside the electrical panel where Miller had been careless in his haste in the dark and the storm. 2 state police officers crossed the frozen lawn at a run. The first one reached Miller and stopped, looking at the dog and the bottle. He looked at Max for a long moment, at the burned patches on his back and the way he held the evidence in his teeth with the patience of a dog waiting for someone authorized to take it. "That's Sergeant Hess's dog," the second officer said quietly. "That's the K9 they reported destroyed last July. I recognize this dog." The USB drive was in Arthur's hand, still warm from the fire. Sarah took it from him and pressed it into the officer's hand and said, "He was married to the woman who was killed." She recorded it. She threw the drive into their garden before she died. The officer looked at the drive, looked at Arthur, sitting in the snow wrapped in a blanket that a neighbor had brought, his white hair scattered, his blind eyes turned toward the burning house. Looked at Max, still holding the bottle, waiting. "Sir," the officer said, and his voice had the quality of a man adjusting internally to something large. "We're going to need to ask you some questions. But first, can someone get this dog a veterinarian?" The handcuffs went on in the light of the burning house. Derek's smooth performance disintegrated as the officers listed what they had: the drive, the bottle, the tire records, the reopened case file that 2 state investigators had already been building from the far end for 3 months. He tried several versions of a different story and then stopped, because there was no version of the story in which Max was not there, patient and burned and absolutely certain. Miller said nothing at all. He looked at Max throughout the entire arrest with the expression of a man encountering something he had believed disposed of and understood. In this moment of all moments, what it cost to believe that living things could be simply erased. The neighbors watched in the orange light and the fading storm. Someone had brought a bowl of water for Max. He drank from it steadily and then looked back at Arthur, and Arthur reached forward through the dark and found the dog's head with his hand, and they stayed like that together in the cold while the fire finished saying what it had come to say. The April morning came in warm and slow, the way the best mornings do in that part of the country, softly, as if light were something offered rather than imposed. The house on Caldwell Lane was different now. The insurance had covered the reconstruction, and what had gone up in its place was essentially the same footprint but without the smell of smoke that Arthur had imagined would inhabit every room forever. The kitchen counter was the same height. The bedroom doorframe was the same distance from the bed. 12 steps to the bathroom. 22 steps to the front door. But there was something different in the weight of the silence. Arthur sat on the porch in a caneback chair that Sarah had helped him find at an estate sale, just like the one Evelyn had kept on the porch of the old house, she'd said, which was not exactly why he'd taken it, but was not entirely not why, either. The sun was on his face, and the garden was smelling of the things April smells of: new soil, early flowers, the complicated aliveness of things that had been dormant and were not anymore. At his feet, Max was lying in the exact posture of a dog at peace. His burns had healed over the winter, the skin underneath growing back with the patient incrementalism of bodies that do not know they are supposed to be defeated. He wore the state police K-9 unit citation on a collar that the department's new commander, not Miller's commander, not Miller's department anymore, had presented at a ceremony that Arthur had attended by touch and sound and the quality of the crowd's feeling, which had been the warm, slightly tearful feeling of a community returning something it had wrongly taken. Max had been formally reinstated as a sworn K-9 unit officer of the state, with honorable disability discharge, benefits, and a service record that now correctly reflected the events of a July night 6 months before those events had caught up with the people responsible for them. Derek was awaiting trial. Miller was in county lockup pending federal corruption charges. The trial date had been set for June. Sarah had testified twice to the state investigators, clear-eyed and exact, and had been thanked in a formal letter from the state attorney's office that she had pinned to the shelter bulletin board. Evelyn's USB drive had contained 47 seconds of dashboard camera footage from her phone, filmed through the windshield of Derek's car in the moment before impact. Not the moment of impact itself, but the reckless, accelerating seconds preceding it. Derek's face briefly visible in the reflection of his own headlights, the license plate legible in the last frame. She had survived long enough to take the drive from her pocket and throw it into the dark, into the garden she knew by heart, toward the tree where she and Arthur had buried a time capsule on their first anniversary in the house. She had thrown it home. Arthur understood now why Max had gone to that tree. He understood that some scents carry more than information. They carry intention, the residue of a last decision made under impossible circumstances. Max had been following the thread of a trail that had been waiting for 7 months for someone with the right nose to read it. On the porch, a robin made its spring sound in the oak tree. The oak tree had survived the fire completely, its roots too deep and wide to be troubled by what had burned above the soil line, its memory of the thing buried beneath it sealed and intact until it was needed. Arthur reached down and his hand found Max's head, resting now against his ankle. The burned patches on the dog's back had grown in softer than the surrounding fur, a different texture, a record of what had happened the way all honest records are, present but not dominating, part of the whole rather than apart from it. You know what she would have said, Arthur said to the dog, to the morning, to the robin in the oak tree. She would have said I took too long. Max's tail moved once. She'd have been right, Arthur said. He sat back in the chair. The sun did what it was doing, and the garden did what it was doing, and the world, which had spent 9 months assembling itself into something that had nearly destroyed him, rested quietly in the ordinary miracle of a Tuesday in April when no one was trying to hurt anyone. Arthur could not see any of it. He could not see the green returning to the garden his wife had loved, or the way the light moved in the oak tree, or the citation on Max's collar catching the sun. He could not see the smoke line on the far wall of the new house that the painters had missed, or the way Max's amber eyes tracked the movements of the yard with the steady, satisfied attention of a dog who has done the thing he was made for and knows it. But he could feel the sun. He could hear the robin and the wind and the deep, rhythmic breathing of the animal at his feet, that slow and certain tide. He could smell the garden waking up from winter. He could feel, in the weight of Max's head against his ankle, the particular and unambiguous meaning of a creature saying, I am here. I am staying. There is nowhere else I would rather be. He did not know the names for what they had given each other, what the old man had given the dog that the world had broken and discarded, and what the dog had given back. He was not sure those names existed in any language he had access to. He only knew that the house on Caldwell Lane had sound in it again, Not the full sound of before, not Evelyn's hum in the kitchen or the particular music of 43 years of a shared life, but something. A beginning. The weight of a warm body at his feet. The morning doing its patient work. Two broken things. Here in the April light. Neither of them as broken as they had been. This is what it means to be found, Arthur thought. Not saved. Not rescued. Just found. In the dark. By something that knew where to look. He laced his fingers in the fur behind Max's ear, and Max pressed upward into the touch with the slow, full weight of absolute trust. And above them the oak tree held everything it had ever been asked to hold. And the spring came on.